She had no idea what was coming for her, but they had no idea who they were messing with. The bright sun hung high in the sky, casting its warm rays over the empty baseball field, the air thick with the smell of freshly cut grass and the distant echo of a game in full swing. Tasha Grant sat on the bleachers, her gaze lingering on the players practicing their swings. She wasn't here for the game, though. She was on a mission, a quiet one, a covert one. Her calm demeanor and the simple hoodie she wore did little to reveal the truth beneath. She wasn't just an ordinary woman at the park. She was an FBI agent. But no one knew that. Not the officers who approached her now. Not the public passing by. And certainly not the two policemen who, under the bright light of the afternoon sun, were about to make a huge mistake. "Hey you." One of the officers, a man in his late 30s with a scruffy beard, waved his hand sharply in Tasha's direction, breaking the calm that had settled over the field. "You can't just hang around here. This is a public space, not a place for loitering." Tasha, who had been taking a mental note of every person and vehicle near the field, didn't flinch at the officer's approach. Instead, she stood up slowly, her posture still relaxed, but the fire behind her eyes was unmistakable. The other officer, younger and a little more eager, stepped forward, his eyes scanning Tasha's face like he was sizing her up. "What's your business here?" he asked, his tone sharp and authoritative. "I'm just enjoying the day," Tasha replied evenly, not giving him more than what he had asked for. But her calm response only seemed to agitate him further. "We don't need people loitering around here, especially not." "Well, people like you," the younger officer muttered, more to himself than to Tasha. She raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond. "What are you, some kind of troublemaker?" the older officer asked, taking a step closer, his hand resting on the side of his holster. Tasha didn't back down, her expression unchanged. She was well aware of the way his gaze shifted when he saw her, the way his eyes traveled from her face to the simple attire she wore. No flashy clothes, no obvious signs of wealth, just the plain hoodie and jeans. She could feel the tension building, but she refused to let it show. The heat of the day didn't compare to the weight of the situation. "I don't think I'm the one you should be concerned about," she said softly, her voice calm, but there was something in it that made the officers hesitate. They exchanged a quick glance, unsure of what to do next. "All right. Well, we're going to need to see some ID," the older officer said, his voice losing some of its edge as he realized that Tasha wasn't the easy target he had expected. Tasha reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. The younger officer, who had already started to reach for his cuffs, paused, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't expected her to be so calm. "You going to give us your ID or not?" The question hung in the air as Tasha glanced up at the clear blue sky, taking a deep breath. She could feel the familiar weight of the badge she carried, hidden beneath her hoodie, the authority it represented far more powerful than the two officers before her. She wasn't just an average civilian. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Tasha hesitated for only a moment, then dialed a number into her phone. "I think you need to speak to someone who'll explain this to you," she said, holding the phone to her ear. The officers looked at each other, confusion creeping into their expressions. The younger officer, clearly annoyed, took another step forward. "What's this, some kind of joke? You're not getting out of this." Tasha didn't flinch. "Just wait," she said calmly, as the phone rang. A few seconds later, a voice on the other end answered. "Agent Grant," came the stern voice of her superior. "Everything's ready?" Tasha's lips curled into a small smile. "Yes," she replied, turning her gaze back to the officers. "But I think you'll want to stop what you're doing right now. I'm with the FBI." The change in the officers' faces was immediate, their confident postures faltering as the realization hit. They glanced at each other, the smugness in their eyes vanishing. The older officer, now visibly flustered, took a half step back, unsure of what to do next. "Wait, you're FBI," the younger officer stammered. Tasha didn't waste any more time with words. She stepped away from the officers, pulling out her badge, holding it up for them to see. The calm, cool authority she had maintained shifted into something much stronger. They both stood there in stunned silence as she took a step closer. "I suggest you stop what you're doing and think very carefully about your next move," Tasha said, her voice colder now, her power undeniable. The younger officer, still processing the turn of events, looked to his partner for guidance. The older officer, now sweating slightly, opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. Tasha stood tall, her gaze unwavering as she prepared for what was to come next. Karma had arrived, and it was about to change everything. As the seconds ticked by, the officers realized that this wasn't just a woman they could bully into submission. She was the one who had the power now. The tables had turned, and the consequences of their actions were already unfolding before their eyes. As Tasha stood there, the weight of her badge still heavy in her hand, the officers began to stammer, unable to hide their shock. The older officer, who had initially been so sure of his actions, stood frozen, his eyes darting from Tasha's badge to her unwavering expression. I didn't know," the younger officer finally muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. The tension that had filled the air just moments ago seemed to shift, replaced now with confusion and guilt. Tasha didn't waste a second on their apologies. She wasn't here for that. She was here to remind them that the law wasn't something to be taken lightly. "You didn't," Tasha replied calmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen this exact scenario before. "But you're going to know now, and I'm going to make sure you understand the gravity of what just happened." The older officer shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the ground. He clearly didn't know what to do next. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but the words were stuck in his throat. Tasha's expression remained cool, unbothered by their obvious discomfort. She could feel the eyes of the people around her, the witnesses who had started to gather at the edge of the field. They were all waiting for something to happen, their breath held in anticipation. Tasha turned her attention back to the younger officer, who had not yet fully recovered from his shock. "You made a mistake," she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to a child who had just broken something valuable. "A big one. But there's still time to fix it." The young officer's face flushed, his pride bruised. He could feel the eyes of his partner on him, the judgment thick in the air. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being on the other side of things. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke again. I'm sorry. Sorry isn't enough," Tasha said, her voice cold but not unkind. "Not this time." She took a step back, her eyes scanning the surroundings, watching as the small crowd of onlookers began to grow. She knew that she had to act quickly. The longer this dragged on, the more chances there were for the situation to escalate again. "I'm going to call this in," she said, pulling out her phone once more. The officers exchanged another uneasy glance, but they made no move to stop her. They had already lost control of the situation, and they both knew it. Tasha's call was brief, but to the point. She spoke with the clarity and authority of someone who had been trained to handle difficult situations with ease. By the time she hung up, the officers were already standing aside, their once confident posture deflated. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder with every passing second, and Tasha could see the panic begin to rise in the eyes of the officers. They had made a terrible mistake, and now they had to face the consequences. When the other officers arrived, Tasha didn't need to explain much. They could see the situation for what it was. The two men had clearly overstepped their bounds, and now they were going to have to answer for it. As the new officers took control of the situation, Tasha turned her back on the scene and began to walk away, her calmness never faltering. But as she reached the edge of the field, she could hear the older officer's voice once again. "I didn't know who you were," he said, his voice full of regret. Tasha stopped, but didn't turn around. She didn't need to. "That's the problem," she said simply, before walking away, her posture as confident as ever. The crowd around the field began to disperse as the sirens grew fainter, but Tasha's words hung in the air. This was the lesson they would carry with them, one they would never forget. And as for Tasha, she knew this was just another day in the life of someone who fought for justice, even when it meant confronting the very people who were supposed to uphold it. As Tasha made her way down the street, her thoughts were already turning to the next steps. The situation with the officers at the baseball field had been handled, but she knew this wasn't the end. It was never the end. She had spent years learning how to play the long game, and this was just another chapter in the ongoing fight. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting an orange glow over the quiet streets. Tasha's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from her superior. "You handled that well. Expect a follow-up. There's more to this than just an isolated incident." Tasha sighed, sliding the phone back into her pocket. She had suspected as much. The officers at the baseball field weren't acting alone. There was a larger web, and she was getting closer to the center. As she continued walking, the weight of the badge around her neck felt heavier. It wasn't just a symbol of her authority. It was a reminder of the responsibility she carried. The phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't a message. It was a call. Tasha quickly answered, knowing it could be important. "Agent Grant," a calm voice came through the line. "We've just received some intel. We need you back at headquarters." "What's going on?" Tasha asked, her tone now sharp, her mind already racing. "There's a pattern," the voice replied. "We're seeing connections between this and some other recent cases. You need to look into it. There's a meeting at 7. Don't be late." The call ended abruptly, and Tasha was left, standing in the middle of the street, the cool evening air brushing against her face. She knew what this meant. The situation at the baseball field was just a small piece of a much bigger puzzle. She needed to gather all the facts, and quickly. As she made her way back to her car, her mind replayed the events of the day. She had handled herself well in the moment, but she had known that her job wasn't just about confronting injustice. It was about uncovering the truth beneath it all. She had seen this kind of thing before. People in power thinking they could get away with anything, hiding behind their uniforms and badges. But Tasha was a different kind of person. She didn't back down. Not when it mattered. Not when it was personal. The car ride to headquarters was quick, but Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She could feel it deep in her gut. There was something more happening here. Something bigger than just a few corrupt officers. She parked her car and walked into the building, her steps confident but quick. As she entered the meeting room, she was met by her colleagues. They all looked up as she entered, their expressions serious. "Glad you could make it," one of them said, offering her a seat. Tasha sat down, her eyes scanning the room. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady. The lead investigator stood up, pulling up a series of files on the projector screen. "We've been tracking several cases of misconduct across the city. What happened at the baseball field is just the tip of the iceberg. These officers have been involved in a pattern of racial profiling, harassment, and abuse of power. We're seeing similar reports across multiple districts." Tasha's brow furrowed as she absorbed the information. "What do we know about the officers involved?" she asked. "We're still gathering information, but based on the intel we've received, these officers have been working together for years. They've been covering for each other, and the corruption runs deep." The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation set in. Tasha's mind raced. She knew this wouldn't be an easy case to crack, but she wasn't about to back down. She had already faced down those who thought they could get away with their actions. And now, it was time to take the fight to the people who thought they were untouchable. "What's our next step?" she asked, her voice filled with determination. "We need to gather more evidence. We need to get them on record. And we need to expose the full extent of the corruption," the lead investigator replied. "It won't be easy, but if anyone can do it, it's you, Agent Grant." Tasha nodded, her resolve hardening. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had the resources, the team, and the determination to see this through. As the meeting wrapped up, Tasha stood and walked toward the door. "I'll get started immediately," she said, her voice unwavering. She knew that this case was going to change everything, and she was ready to see it through to the end. As she walked out of the building and into the night, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to something big, something that would shake the very foundations of the system. And when it all came to light, there would be no hiding from the truth. The following day, Tasha arrived at her desk early, the office still quiet, the early morning light creeping through the blinds. The air smelled of coffee and paper, and the soft hum of the overhead lights filled the otherwise empty space. She was used to working under pressure, but today felt different. There was something about the case she had just been handed that tugged at her in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about the officers at the baseball field anymore. It was about something much larger. As she sat down, her phone buzzed, a reminder of the meeting with her team scheduled for later that day. But Tasha wasn't ready to join the others just yet. She needed to review the files. The corruption, the racial profiling, the abuse of power, it was all too familiar. But this time, she wasn't just going to let it slide. She had seen enough to know that change wouldn't come unless someone fought for it. And she was that someone. Opening the first file on her desk, Tasha began scanning the details. The officers involved in the Incidents had all come from the same district. Their names appeared repeatedly in reports, but there was nothing conclusive to tie them together, nothing concrete that could bring them down. It was as if they were too careful, covering their tracks at every turn. But Tasha wasn't convinced. She knew that every pattern had a crack, a flaw. She just needed to find it. As she scrolled through the digital documents, her mind was already piecing things together. The incidents were isolated at first glance, but something about them didn't sit right. The same names kept popping up in different reports, officers from the same precinct, all connected to various complaints, yet none of them ever faced real consequences. It was a well-oiled machine of corruption, and now it was Tasha's job to tear it apart. The more she looked, the more she saw the web of lies and deceit surrounding these officers. They had been involved in everything from racial profiling to illegal searches to false arrests. And what made it worse was that they had done it all in plain sight, knowing they were protected. Tasha couldn't ignore the feeling that these incidents weren't as random as they appeared. There was a reason these officers had been operating without fear of reprisal. They had to be connected to something bigger. Her gut told her that this was a systematic issue, something that had been allowed to fester for far too long. She closed the file, her jaw clenched, and leaned back in her chair. She had been in this position before, chasing after corruption, chasing after those who believed they were above the law. And every time, she had gotten closer. But this time felt different. There was more at stake. The people involved weren't just petty criminals or corrupt officials. They were part of an institution that was supposed to protect the public. She wasn't about to let them continue operating in the shadows. Tasha picked up her phone again and dialed the number of her contact at the federal office. She needed information, and she needed it fast. "Agent Grant," came the voice on the other end. "What's the update?" "I've reviewed the files," Tasha said, her voice steady. "The officers involved are connected, but I need to dig deeper. There's something more here, and I can feel it. We're dealing with more than just a few bad cops." There was a pause on the other end, and Tasha could hear the rustling of papers. "You're right," the voice replied. "We've been getting the same intel. This goes deeper than just local corruption. We'll need to move quickly." Tasha's mind was already running through the steps. "I'll meet you at the office in an hour," she said before hanging up. As she stood up and gathered her things, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of something big. This case had the potential to change everything. But it would take more than just paperwork and reports. It would take all her focus, all her determination, and every ounce of her skill to bring these officers to justice. As she left the office, the weight of the day ahead settled in her chest. She knew the path wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, and there would be those who tried to stop her. But Tasha was ready. She had been down this road before. She knew the stakes, and she knew that she was the only one who could make a difference. The next morning, Tasha arrived at the federal office, her mind racing with the new developments from the previous day. The meeting she had scheduled was critical, and she couldn't afford to waste any time. As she entered the building, the cool air inside hit her like a wave, contrasting with the warm sunlight outside. The buzz of activity in the lobby was palpable, with agents and staff moving quickly from one task to another. But none of that mattered to Tasha right now. She was focused, her determination stronger than ever. She made her way to the conference room, where her colleagues were already gathered. As she entered, the room fell silent, and all eyes turned to her. "Agent Grant," her superior said with a nod, "we've been expecting you." Tasha returned the nod and took a seat at the table, her eyes scanning the files in front of her. "I've reviewed the intel," she said, her voice steady. "The officers involved in this, there's a network. They've been operating for years, and it's much bigger than we thought." Her colleagues exchanged concerned glances. "What exactly are we looking at?" one of them asked. "Corruption, racial profiling, misuse of power. They've been systematically abusing their positions, and now it's time to bring them down," Tasha replied, her voice low but filled with conviction. She paused for a moment before continuing. "These officers have covered their tracks for years, but they've made a mistake. I'm going to find the evidence, and when I do, I'm going to expose everything." The room was silent for a few moments as everyone absorbed the gravity of Tasha's words. They knew what she was saying was true. This wasn't just about a few bad apples. This was a systemic issue, and it would take everything they had to root it out. "We've been gathering intel on the precincts they're connected to," her superior said. "But we need to move quickly. They know we're coming for them. We can't let them slip through the cracks. Tasha nodded, her focus unshaken. I'll get the information we need, she said. But I'll need full access to the files and resources. We can't do this without all the pieces. You'll have everything you need, the superior assured her. We're behind you all the way. Tasha stood, her mind already running through the next steps. She wasn't going to let these officers walk away unscathed. They had to be held accountable, and she was going to make sure they were. As she left the meeting, Tasha couldn't help but feel the weight of the task ahead. But there was no turning back now. She knew the stakes. She knew that what she was doing would make waves, and she was ready for it. As the hours passed, Tasha and her team worked tirelessly, piecing together information from various sources. They dug through case files, surveillance footage, and witness statements, all the while keeping an eye out for the one piece of evidence that would tie everything together. Tasha's gut told her that they were close. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. There was something out there, something that would bring everything to light. And she wasn't going to stop until she found it. Later that night, as Tasha sat in her office, reviewing the latest batch of files, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from her contact at the local precinct. "We've got something," the message read. "Meet me at the station in an hour." Tasha's heart raced. This was it. She grabbed her jacket and rushed out the door, the anticipation building with every step. When she arrived at the precinct, she was greeted by her contact, who handed her a manila folder. "This is it," he said, his voice low. Tasha opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents inside. It was a series of internal memos, all connected to the officers they had been tracking. There, in black and white, was the evidence they had been searching for. "This is it," Tasha whispered to herself. "This is the break we needed." She knew they had enough now to take down the network. But as she looked over the documents again, something caught her eye. One name kept appearing in the memos, someone high up in the chain of command. Someone with the power to protect these officers. Tasha's eyes narrowed as she read the name again. This was bigger than she had thought. They weren't just up against a group of corrupt officers. They were up against a system. And now, Tasha was more determined than ever to bring it all down. As Tasha sat at her desk, the weight of the evidence in front of her was almost suffocating. The memos she had received from her contact at the precinct confirmed her worst fear. This wasn't just about a few corrupt officers. It was a system that had been carefully built and maintained for years. The name that kept appearing in the documents was one that Tasha had hoped she would never encounter. Chief Donovan. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone in the department had. He was untouchable, protected by layers of bureaucracy and political power. The realization hit her hard. The corruption wasn't just happening on the street level. It reached all the way to the top. And Chief Donovan was at the center of it all. Tasha knew she couldn't tackle this alone. She needed backup, but not just anyone. She needed a team that could handle the scope of what they were about to uncover. She dialed the number of her most trusted colleague, Agent Harrison. "Harrison," she said when he picked up, her voice steady but urgent. "We've got a problem. It's bigger than we thought. I need you to meet me at the office. Now." "On my way," Harrison replied, his voice already filled with understanding. Tasha stood up and paced around her office, her mind racing with thoughts of how to proceed. She couldn't just storm into the precinct and confront Donovan. If she did, it would be the end of her career, and the system would bury the truth. She needed to be smarter than that. As she looked over the files again, a plan began to form. She had the evidence, but what she didn't have was the leverage to bring down someone like Donovan. He wasn't just a corrupt officer. He was a political powerhouse, with connections in every corner of the system. Tasha needed to find a way to make him slip, to expose his lies without directly confronting him. The sound of a knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Harrison standing in the doorway, his expression serious. "What's going on?" he asked, stepping inside. Tasha quickly filled him in on the situation. "We've got a network of officers involved in racial profiling and corruption," she said, her tone low. "But it goes deeper. Donovan is at the heart of it all. And if we don't move quickly, he'll cover his tracks and make sure no one gets to him." Harrison nodded, already understanding the gravity of the situation. "So what's the plan?" Tasha walked over to the whiteboard in the corner of the room, her mind already working out the details. "We're going to go after Donovan's network, piece by piece. We start with the officers who are closest to him. They've been covering for him for years, and now they'll be the key to exposing everything." Harrison raised an eyebrow. You think they'll flip? They will, Tasha said confidently. They've been in this too long. They know the consequences if they don't cooperate. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. But we need to move fast. If Donovan gets wind of this, he'll shut it all down before we can do anything. The tension in the room was palpable as Harrison processed the plan. All right, let's do it, he said finally. We'll go after the network first, and then we'll hit Donovan when the time is right. Tasha nodded, grateful for his support. Together, they gathered the necessary resources, pulling together a team of agents who could help track down the officers involved in Donovan's network. They knew this wouldn't be easy, but Tasha had no intention of backing down. Not now, not when they were so close. As they worked into the night, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fall into place. The officers who had been working with Donovan had their own weaknesses, small, seemingly insignificant details that would be enough to make them crack under pressure. Tasha and her team worked tirelessly, tracking down the officers' whereabouts, making covert visits to their homes, and gathering information on their personal lives. They were playing a dangerous game, but Tasha wasn't afraid. She had faced danger before. This was no different. The next morning, Tasha and Harrison sat in the dimly lit conference room, looking over the files they had gathered. We've got enough, Harrison said, his voice filled with determination. We can take them down now. Tasha glanced at the clock. The time was drawing near. Not yet, she said. We wait. We have to wait for the right moment to strike. You think Donovan's going to make a move? Harrison asked. He's already making his move, Tasha replied. He knows we're closing in on him. But he's arrogant. He'll slip up. And when he does, that's when we'll take him down. The two agents exchanged a knowing look. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. They had to stay patient. They had to wait for Donovan to make the mistake that would finally bring his empire crashing down. The days seemed to stretch on as Tasha and her team worked tirelessly behind the scenes. The pressure was mounting, and with each passing hour, the urgency of the situation grew. Tasha could feel it in her bones. The walls were closing in, and Donovan's empire of corruption was about to collapse. She had been down this road before, but this time, something felt different. This time, the stakes were higher. As the team continued their investigation, Tasha kept a careful eye on Donovan's movements. She knew that the key to bringing him down wasn't just about catching the officers who had been involved. It was about getting to him directly. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Donovan had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. He had been untouchable because he had carefully crafted a web of protection around himself. No one had dared to challenge him. Until now. Tasha's mind raced as she worked late into the night, reviewing the latest reports from her team. They had tracked down several officers who had been working closely with Donovan, and they had started to build a case. But the final piece was still missing. She needed to find a way to make Donovan slip, to expose the man who had been pulling the strings all along. She couldn't let him walk free. The next morning, as Tasha sat at her desk, her phone rang. It was Harrison. We've got something, he said, his voice sharp. You need to see this. Tasha stood up immediately, her pulse quickening. She grabbed her jacket and headed to the office where Harrison was waiting. When she arrived, he was already at his desk, the computer screen showing a series of surveillance photos. This is it, Harrison said, pointing to one of the images. It's Donovan. He's meeting with someone in the parking garage. We think he's making a deal. Tasha leaned in, studying the photo carefully. The man in the picture was unmistakably Donovan, his posture confident, his expression guarded. The person he was meeting with was someone Tasha didn't recognize, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Donovan was finally making a move. This could be the breakthrough we need, Tasha said, her voice steady. We need to track this meeting. If we can get the right information, we'll have him. Harrison nodded. I'll get the team together. We'll be ready. The plan was simple. They would stake out the parking garage and wait for Donovan to arrive. Once he made the deal, they would move in quickly, gather the evidence, and make their arrest. But Tasha knew it wouldn't be that easy. Donovan was too careful. He wouldn't make a move without covering his tracks. As the team prepared for the operation, Tasha's mind kept returning to one question. What was Donovan hiding? What could he possibly be so desperate to protect? She couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something far bigger than they had anticipated. That evening, as the sun began to set, the team gathered in the unmarked vehicles, parked in a nearby alley, waiting for Donovan to show up. The air was thick with anticipation. Tasha glanced at her watch, her fingers drumming nervously against the steering wheel. "He's late," Harrison said, his voice tight with tension. "He's always late," Tasha replied. "But he'll come. He won't be able to resist making this deal." The minutes ticked by slowly, each one seeming to stretch on forever. Tasha's nerves were on edge, but she didn't show it. She had been in high-stakes situations before, and she knew how to keep her composure. This was just another moment that would require her focus. Suddenly, a car pulled into the garage. It was Donovan. Tasha's heart skipped a beat as she watched him step out, adjusting his jacket before walking toward the meeting spot. She glanced at the rest of the team, signaling them to move into position. As Donovan met with the mysterious figure, Tasha felt the weight of the moment settle in. This was it. They were about to get the evidence they needed. She had to stay calm, but she could feel the adrenaline pumping through her veins. This was the turning point. Everything they had worked for had led to this moment. Donovan wasn't just a corrupt officer anymore. He was the center of an entire system, and Tasha was going to take it down. As the two men exchanged words, Tasha's team carefully recorded the conversation, their eyes trained on every movement. Then, without warning, the unexpected happened. The mysterious figure looked up, his eyes locking with Tasha's. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The man's expression shifted, and Tasha saw something in his eyes that sent a chill down her spine. He knew they were there, and he was about to make a move of his own. "We need to move now," Tasha whispered into her radio. "He knows we're here." The team sprang into action, surrounding the area quickly, but Donovan had already realized what was happening. As the agents closed in, Tasha's heart raced. This was it. The operation had just gone into high gear. The man they had been tracking for months was finally cornered. But as they made their way toward Donovan, something unexpected happened. The man he had been meeting with suddenly broke into a run, disappearing into the shadows before anyone could stop him. "He got away," one of the agents said, frustration in his voice. Tasha stood there for a moment, watching the shadows where the man had disappeared. But her resolve didn't falter. "It's not over yet," she said firmly. "We've got Donovan, and we're not letting him slip away." As Tasha and her team regrouped, frustration hung thick in the air. The man they had been tailing had disappeared into the shadows, and now they were left with only half the answers they needed. Donovan was in custody, but the bigger picture remained elusive. Tasha's mind was working overtime, piecing together the fragmented puzzle that still didn't make sense. The strange meeting in the parking garage, the mysterious man who had slipped away, and the larger web of corruption all pointed to one undeniable truth. They were on the brink of uncovering something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. "We've got Donovan," Harrison said, his voice low. "But what about the other guy? Who was he meeting with?" Tasha didn't answer immediately. She stood there for a moment, her eyes fixed on Donovan, who was now seated in the back of an unmarked police car. He was cuffed, his expression a mixture of disbelief and quiet anger. The look on his face told her everything she needed to know. He had underestimated them. He thought he was untouchable, and now he was paying the price for that arrogance. But even as she felt a flicker of triumph, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Donovan was just one piece of the puzzle. They needed to get to the people behind him, the ones who had protected him, who had kept him in power. "We need to find out who he was meeting with," Tasha said finally, her voice steady and focused. "If we can figure that out, we'll have the leverage we need to bring the whole system down." Harrison nodded. "I'll get the team on it," he said. "We'll trace the man's movements, see if we can find any connections." Tasha turned to face the rest of the team, who were waiting expectantly. "Donovan's been taken care of for now, but we can't let up. We need to dig deeper, find out who's really behind all of this." The team exchanged glances, their resolve unwavering. They had come too far to back down now. They knew what was at stake. Tasha's phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the silence. She pulled it out quickly and saw that it was a message from her superior. "We've just received intel," the message read. "Donovan's not the only one involved. There's more. Meet us at the office in 1 hour." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the breakthrough they had been waiting for. She quickly passed the word to the team, and within minutes, they were on their way back to the office. The atmosphere was tense, but there was also a sense of anticipation in the air. Tasha couldn't afford to let her guard down, Not yet. They were so close. As she entered the conference room, her colleagues were already gathered, their faces serious. Tasha took a seat at the table, her eyes scanning the room. "What's the update?" she asked. Her superior stood up, holding a folder in his hands. "We've been tracking Donovan's network, and it turns out there's more to this than we thought. There's a larger group of officers involved, and they've been working together for years." Tasha leaned forward, her mind racing. Who's behind it? Who's pulling the strings? Her superior opened the folder, revealing a series of photos and documents. "We believe there's a link between Donovan and several other high-ranking officials. The corruption runs deeper than we ever imagined." Tasha's eyes narrowed as she examined the files. This was bigger than just a few bad cops. This was systemic, a network of corruption that had infiltrated every level of law enforcement. It was going to take everything they had to expose it. "What do we do now?" Tasha asked, her voice firm. "We go after the rest of the network." Her superior replied, "We'll take them down one by one, starting with the officers closest to Donovan. We have the evidence now. It's time to move." Tasha nodded, her determination burning brighter than ever. She knew what had to be done. It was time to finish what they had started. As they began to make their plans, Tasha's mind was already running through the next steps. She could feel the weight of the case on her shoulders, but she wasn't going to let it stop her. They had come too far to turn back now. The walls of corruption were crumbling, piece by piece, and Tasha was determined to see it through to the end. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Tasha and her team followed the leads they had uncovered, tracking down the officers who were part of Donovan's network. With each arrest, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. But Tasha knew that the final step was the most crucial one. They needed to get to the heart of the corruption, to the ones who had been covering up for Donovan all these years. As the sun began to set, Tasha stood outside the precinct, staring at the building as if willing the answers to reveal themselves. She could feel the tension in the air, but she also knew that this was the moment. The storm was coming, and when it did, it would wash away the corruption that had stained the system for so long. Tasha was ready. She wasn't going to stop until every last piece of this puzzle was put together and the people responsible for all this had been brought to justice. The weight of the case was beginning to take its toll on Tasha. The hours spent chasing down leads, the sleepless nights reviewing evidence, it was all starting to blur together. Yet, there was no time for fatigue. The walls of corruption were crumbling, but the enemy was still out there, trying to cover their tracks, desperate to maintain their power. Tasha couldn't afford to let up now. As she sat at her desk, her eyes fixed on the map of the city, she reviewed the final set of leads they had gathered. The officers they had arrested were cooperating, but Tasha knew it wasn't enough. The key to bringing down the network, the heart of the corruption, was still out of reach. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. She had been at this for hours, but the silence in the office was deafening. The team had left for the night, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Tasha ran her fingers through her hair, trying to clear her mind. It was then that her phone rang, the sound cutting through the stillness of the room. "Agent Grant," she said, answering the call quickly. "Tasha, we've got a breakthrough," came Harrison's voice on the other end. "You need to get down here." Tasha's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "We traced one of Donovan's contacts." "It's big, Tasha. We've got the last piece of the puzzle." Tasha stood up, grabbing her jacket. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." The drive to the office felt like the longest of her life. The anticipation, the adrenaline, it all built to a crescendo as she arrived at the station. Harrison was waiting for her, his face a mixture of excitement and urgency. "What did you find?" Tasha asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Harrison handed her a file, thick with paperwork. "This is it," he said, nodding toward the documents. "Donovan's been working with someone high up. Someone we didn't expect." Tasha's eyes scanned the papers, her heart racing as she absorbed the details. The name that jumped out at her was one she knew all too well, Mayor Thompson. The realization hit her like a wave. The mayor? How deep did this corruption run? This wasn't just about a few crooked cops anymore. This was about a system that had been completely compromised, all the way to the top. Tasha's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still so much to uncover. "What now?" she asked, her voice low and determined. "We go after Thompson," Harrison replied. "We have the evidence now. We can't wait any longer." Tasha nodded. It was time to make the final move. She knew the risks, but she also knew that this was the only chance they would get to take down the entire network. The operation to bring down Mayor Thompson would be risky, but they had no other choice. The morning light began to filter in through the blinds as Tasha gathered her team. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was the culmination of everything they had worked for, and they couldn't afford to mess it up. As they made their way to the mayor's office, Tasha's mind was racing. She could already picture the scene. The mayor's smug expression as he tried to deny everything. The officers he had corrupted, the system that had allowed all of this to happen. But no matter how much he fought, no matter how many lies he told, Tasha knew the truth would come out. The team arrived at the mayor's office, the tension in the air almost unbearable. They were about to face the man who had helped orchestrate everything. As they stepped inside, the mayor was sitting behind his desk, a calm expression on his face, as though he had no idea what was coming. "Good morning, Mayor Thompson," Tasha said, her voice firm and professional. "We need to talk." Thompson's eyes narrowed as he looked up, but he didn't say anything. Tasha could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the understanding that his time was running out. "You've been running a corrupt network for years," Tasha continued, her voice steady. "And today it ends." The mayor leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Agent Grant," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I've got people in the right places. You can't touch me." Tasha didn't flinch. She had been expecting this. "The people you've been relying on won't protect you anymore," she said, her gaze unwavering. "We've got the evidence, and we're going to take you down." The mayor's expression faltered for the briefest moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You think you're the first to try this? You think I'm scared of you," he said, his voice rising. Tasha stepped forward, placing a stack of files on his desk. "The evidence is right here, Thompson. The network you've built, the corruption you've fueled. It all ends today." For a moment, the room was silent. The mayor seemed to consider his options, but there was nothing he could do. He was cornered. "You won't get away with this," Thompson finally muttered, his arrogance giving way to anger. "I have more power than you could ever understand." Tasha took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. Power doesn't mean anything when the truth comes out. She looked around the room at her team, knowing that this was the moment they had been working toward. They had the evidence, and now, it was time to make sure the system of corruption that had controlled the city for so long would finally be brought down. As Tasha and her team stood in the mayor's office, the silence was almost suffocating. Mayor Thompson's face, once full of arrogance, now showed the faintest crack of fear. The evidence was undeniable, the corruption laid bare for all to see. But even now, in the face of his downfall, Thompson refused to give in. "You really think this is it? You think you've won?" he sneered, his voice shaking with frustration. "You have no idea what I control. I could bury you and everyone you care about with just one call." Tasha took a deep breath, her gaze never wavering from his. "You've been running this city with fear for too long," she said firmly, her voice steady and resolute. "But your time is up. The system you've built is coming down, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." She stepped closer, placing a stack of files on his desk. "We have all the proof we need, Thompson. It's over." Thompson's eyes flickered to the files, then back to Tasha. For a moment, he seemed to falter, as if the weight of her words had begun to sink in. But just as quickly, his defiance returned. "You think anyone will believe you? I have connections everywhere. There are too many people in my pocket for you to touch me." Tasha didn't flinch. "You can't silence the truth, no matter how much power you have," she replied. "The evidence is already out there. The people you've been oppressing are starting to speak out. The system you've protected is falling apart." Thompson stood up suddenly, slamming his hands down on the desk in a fit of anger. "You have no idea what you're doing," he growled. "This city runs because of people like me. You think the world will be better off without me? You're delusional." Tasha remained calm, unfazed by his outburst. "The world will be better off without people like you," she said, her voice cold. "You've been exploiting your position for years, and now it's time for you to answer for it." There was a long pause as Thompson seemed to contemplate his next move. Tasha could see the gears turning in his head, the way he was trying to calculate his escape. But it was too late. He had no more tricks up his sleeve. "You won't get away with this," Thompson muttered, his voice barely audible. "You think you've beaten me, but you haven't seen the last of me." Tasha stepped back, signaling to her team. "Take him away," she said firmly, "and make sure every piece of evidence is sealed. This ends now." As Thompson was escorted out of the room, Tasha stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The fight wasn't over, but this was a significant victory. She had brought down one of the most corrupt individuals in the city, and she knew it was just the beginning. The system that had allowed Thompson to thrive was beginning to collapse, and with each step, Tasha and her team were getting closer to uncovering the truth. But there was still so much to do. The arrests had been made, the evidence collected, but there were still those who were part of the network that needed to be exposed. Tasha knew that Thompson was just one player in a much larger game. And as much as she wanted to savor the moment, she couldn't afford to stop now. The investigation had only scratched the surface. "What's next?" Harrison asked, his voice filled with anticipation. Tasha looked around at her team, their faces tired but determined. "We keep pushing," she said, her voice steady. "We don't stop until we've taken down the entire network." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in. "This city deserves better, and we're going to make sure they get it." The team nodded in unison, ready for whatever came next. As they left the mayor's office, Tasha felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. She had always known that bringing down corruption would be a long and difficult road. But now, with Thompson in custody and the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight was far from over. But Tasha was more determined than ever to see it through. She had started this journey to expose the truth, and she wouldn't stop until justice was served. As they walked out of the building, the weight of the battle ahead hung over her, but for the first time in a long while, Tasha felt like they were on the verge of winning. She had fought for this, and now, the system that had protected the corrupt was finally starting to crack. And she would be there, every step of the way, to make sure it all came crashing down. The hours following Thompson's arrest were a whirlwind of activity, but Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that they were still on the edge of something much bigger. Donovan was in custody, but the network they were dismantling was far from finished. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they were still chasing shadows. As she sat at her desk, reviewing the latest developments, her mind was already moving ahead. She couldn't afford to rest, not when there was so much at stake. The corruption wasn't just something she could expose and walk away from. It was systemic, entrenched in the very institutions that were meant to protect the people. And it wasn't going to be easy to root out. Harrison's voice brought her back to the present. "Tasha, you need to see this." She looked up to see him standing in the doorway, holding a folder in his hand. He didn't need to say anything else. Tasha stood up and followed him into the conference room. As she sat down, Harrison opened the folder, revealing a new set of files. "This is what we found," he said, sliding the papers across the table to her. Tasha's heart skipped a beat as she glanced over the documents. These weren't just any papers. They were the final connections she had been looking for, names, dates, and locations that tied Mayor Thompson to an even larger conspiracy. "This goes all the way to the top," Tasha murmured, her voice filled with realization. Thompson wasn't working alone. He had help from some very powerful people. Harrison nodded, his expression grim. "We've got names, and we're tracing the money now. There's a whole network of people who have been using their power for personal gain, and they're not going to give up without a fight." Tasha felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about taking down a few corrupt individuals. It was about exposing an entire system built on lies and manipulation. And she wasn't going to stop until it all came crashing down. "What's our next move?" she asked. "We need to follow the money," Harrison replied. "If we can trace the flow of funds, we'll have enough to bring down the rest of the network. But we need to move fast. They're going to start covering their tracks." Tasha nodded. "I'll get the team on it. We'll find the connections and take down every last one of them." The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and more paperwork. Tasha and her team worked around the clock, following every lead, every small piece of evidence that could help them get closer to the people behind the corruption. But the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. As night fell, Tasha sat alone in her office, going over the details one last time. She could feel the weight of the case pressing down on her. She had been in high-stakes situations before, but this was different. The people they were going after weren't just criminals. They were the very ones who had controlled the system for years. They had the power, the influence, and the resources to stop her at any moment. But Tasha wasn't afraid. She had come too far to back down now. The sound of footsteps outside her door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Harrison standing there, a look of concern on his face. "What's wrong?" she asked. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice low. "The money trail has gone cold. Whoever is at the top of this is covering their tracks better than we thought." Tasha's heart sank. They had been so close. "Do we have anything left to go on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Harrison hesitated before speaking again. "There's one more lead," he said. "It's risky, but it could be the break we need." Tasha stood up, determination hardening in her chest. "What's the lead?" Harrison handed her a folder, his eyes filled with urgency. "We've got a name. A contact who might know more about the people behind it all. But we have to be careful. If they catch wind of this, it could be over." Tasha didn't hesitate. "We're going after this lead. We can't afford to wait." As she walked out of the office, she could feel the weight of the task ahead of her. But she wasn't about to stop now. The fight had only just begun. She had come this far, and she was determined to see it through to the end. This was bigger than her. It was bigger than anyone on her team. It was about justice, about taking down the system that had allowed corruption to thrive for so long. And Tasha was ready for whatever came next. The night was quiet, the city streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Tasha sat in the unmarked car, her fingers drumming against the wheel as she waited. The lead had taken them to a small diner at the edge of town, a place that seemed inconspicuous at first glance, but Tasha knew better. The man they were meeting had information, and it could be the key to unraveling the last thread of corruption they hadn't yet touched. Harrison sat beside her, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. Tasha nodded, her gaze fixed on the door of the diner. "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice steady. "This could be the break we've been waiting for." The tension in the car was palpable. Tasha had been in dangerous situations before, but tonight felt different. Everything they had worked for, all the hours spent digging through files, chasing leads, and tracking down connections, had led to this moment. But she knew that the truth they were about to uncover could shake the very foundation of the system. The door of the diner opened, and a figure stepped out, casting a long shadow on the pavement. Tasha's pulse quickened as she recognized the man, the informant who had promised to help them expose the full extent of the corruption. He was a former officer, someone who had been on the inside, and now he was ready to talk. He walked toward the car, his face tense, his eyes darting around as if he feared being followed. Tasha and Harrison stepped out of the car, and the man stopped a few feet away. "You got the documents?" Tasha asked, her voice calm but firm. The man nodded, glancing around nervously. "I've got everything, but we need to move fast. They know I'm talking. They're already looking for me." Tasha felt a cold shiver run down her spine. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. "Where's the evidence?" she asked. The man handed over a small, thick envelope, his hands shaking. "All of it's in there. The names, the money trail, everything. It goes all the way to the top. Thompson was just a pawn. There are others pulling the strings." Tasha took the envelope carefully, her fingers brushing against the cold paper. She didn't need to open it right away. She could already feel the weight of it. "Thank you," she said, her voice low. The man nodded, looking over his shoulder nervously. "I don't want to be here when you open that. They'll come for me next. I've done what I can. Now it's on you." Without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows, blending into the night like a ghost. Tasha and Harrison stood there for a moment, the envelope in Tasha's hand heavy with the promise of a new truth. "This is it," Harrison said, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. "We've got everything we need to bring them down." Tasha nodded, but her mind was already working. She didn't trust that this was going to be as easy as it seemed. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. And as much as they had uncovered, she knew that the Real fight was just beginning. "Let's go," Tasha said, her voice steady, but her eyes hard with determination. The car ride back to the office was silent, each of them lost in their thoughts. The streets seemed emptier now, the weight of the moment settling in as they neared their destination. Tasha couldn't help but think about everything that had led to this point. The years of corruption, the lives ruined, the system that had been allowed to thrive. But now, they were on the verge of tearing it all down. She glanced at Harrison, who was staring out the window, his expression unreadable. "You all right?" she asked. Harrison turned to her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah," he said, though his voice was laced with a quiet intensity. "I just keep thinking about how many people have been hurt by this. How many more are still out there, living under the weight of all this corruption. We've got to make sure it doesn't happen again." Tasha nodded, her mind already racing with the steps they needed to take. The evidence in her hand was a key, a way to unlock the rest of the truth. They weren't done yet. They had to expose everyone involved, no matter how high up they were. And Tasha was ready. As they pulled into the parking lot, Tasha's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, another message from her superior. "We've got confirmation. The mayor's office is implicated. We need to move fast." Tasha's pulse quickened. The final piece had just fallen into place. This was it. The final confrontation was approaching. Everything they had done, every choice they had made, had led them to this moment. And Tasha wasn't going to back down now. "Let's do this," she said, her voice a quiet vow. The team moved quickly, gathering around the conference table, ready to make their next move. The night was far from over, and the fight was only going to get fiercer. But Tasha was ready for it. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop until the entire corrupt system was exposed. It was time to finish what they had started. The final hours before the operation felt like a blur. Tasha sat at her desk, eyes scanning the files, the room around her quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of her pen on the surface. The evidence was all laid out before her. The mayor's involvement, the network of corrupt officials, the damning documents. It was all there. But even with everything they had, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were missing something. It had been a long journey to this point. They had uncovered a vast network of corruption, a system that had been allowed to flourish for years, and now they were about to bring it all crashing down. But there was no time to pause, no time to think about the weight of it all. She had one goal now, to take down everyone involved, no matter how high up they were. The team was ready. Harrison, her trusted partner, was at her side. The rest of the agents were already assembling in the briefing room, the tension in the air almost tangible. Tasha stood up, pushing the files aside as she made her way to the door. As she walked down the hallway, her mind flashed back to the first moments of this investigation, the small leads, the slow unraveling of the truth, and the countless hours spent following dead ends. But now, it was all coming together. They were close, too close to fail. The meeting room was already set up when she arrived, the team gathered around, all eyes on her. "We've come a long way," Tasha began, her voice steady and authoritative. "But this is it. This is where we bring it all to the surface. Today, we take down the network." She glanced at the faces around her. She saw determination in their eyes, but she also saw something else, fear. Not of failure, but of what would come after. The system they had been working to dismantle wasn't just corrupt. It was powerful. But Tasha wasn't afraid. "We know the mayor's office is implicated," she continued, pacing the room. "We know who's involved, and we have the evidence. But we're not just going after the mayor. We're going after the entire system. Every last person who's had a hand in this corruption is going down." Harrison nodded, his eyes sharp with focus. "We have the warrants, the evidence, and the team. It's time." Tasha took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. She knew what was at stake. This is the moment we've all been waiting for. We do this right, and we put an end to a system that's been broken for too long. She could see the resolve in their faces, the quiet determination to finish what they had started. "We move quickly. No hesitation. We get in, we get the evidence, and we make the arrests. We don't give them time to cover their tracks." She looked around the room, meeting each agent's eyes. "Are we ready?" The room was silent for a moment, and then, one by one, the team nodded. "Let's do this," Tasha said, her voice firm. As they filed out of the room, the tension was thick in the air. There was no turning back now. They had the evidence, they had the warrants, and they had the courage to see it through. The team split up, each heading to their assigned locations. Tasha's heart was pounding as she walked toward the front door, but her mind was focused. They had worked too hard to let this slip away now. As she got into the car, Harrison by her side, Tasha glanced at the files one last time. They were moments away from exposing everything, the corruption, the lies, the people who had been operating above the law for far too long. It was time to take action. As they drove toward the mayor's office, Tasha could feel the weight of the final moments building. She wasn't just about to take down a corrupt politician. She was about to expose the entire system. The stakes had never been higher. The mayor would not go down without a fight, but Tasha was prepared. They had everything they needed, and she was determined to see it through. The operation went off without a hitch. The mayor's office was raided, his files seized, and his closest associates arrested. Tasha and her team worked efficiently, gathering evidence, making sure every document was accounted for. The mayor, once so confident, now stood silently in the corner of his office, his face drained of color. Tasha approached him, her expression cold. "You're done," she said quietly. "This is over." The mayor opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was cornered, his network falling apart around him. "The system is broken," Tasha said, her voice filled with conviction. "And we're fixing it." As the mayor was led out of the building, Tasha stood there for a moment, watching the officers take him away. The battle was over. The truth had won. But Tasha knew this was just the beginning. They had exposed the corruption, but now they had to rebuild. The system had to be fixed, piece by piece, and Tasha would be there every step of the way to make sure it happened. As she looked out over the city, the weight of what they had accomplished settled over her. The fight had been long, but they had won. The system was broken, but now they would rebuild it, one step at a time.